Hello, and welcome to FHFA's virtual roundtable on the Federal Home Loan Bank System at 100, focusing on the future. Good morning to our roundtable participants and to those from Hawaii or American Samoa, and good afternoon to those of you in other time zones. My name is Amy Bogdan. I am Associate Director of Regulatory Policy and Programs in FHFA's Division of Federal Home Loan Bank Regulation. Joining me in moderating this roundtable is Tiffany Moore, the manager of the Federal Home Loan Bank's Affordable Housing Programs branch in FHFA's Division of Housing Mission and Goals. We would like to thank our roundtable participants and all of you watching on the live stream. We have been very pleased with the high level of stakeholder interest. I will turn it over to Tiffany, who will provide today's opening remarks. Tiffany.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Let me also say thank you again to our roundtable participants and guests. We have been encouraged by the wide interest in this initiative, including people supporting affordable housing, community and economic development, banking and housing finance, and academia and research. As Amy noted, we are nearing the end of our roundtable discussions. FHFA hosted the inaugural roundtable just about 4.5 months ago in Washington, D.C., where we explored questions on the mission and purpose of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. A video recording and transcript of that event and other roundtable discussions are available on FHFA's website, and I would encourage anyone watching today to go back and watch those discussions. These roundtables are the second phase of our Federal Home Loan Bank System at 100, focusing on the future initiative. In mid-2022, FHFA Director Sandra Thompson announced FHFA would begin a comprehensive review of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. We kicked off the initiative with what turned out to be a 3-day, 3-part listening session due to such high-level interest. Videos of this event can also be found on our website for all that are interested. Today's roundtable will focus on access to the Federal Home Loan Bank System in Hawaii and American Samoa. We welcome bold ideas and innovation. We also welcome recommendations that can be implemented in the near term. The Federal Home Loan Bank System has remained a critical source of liquidity since its inception 90 years ago. This is especially true during times of market stress, and particularly for smaller members that often haven't had access to other sources of funding. We would like to explore where and how the banks can expand their scope and thinking to be creative and to think more broadly, and how the banks may help with affordability concerns that are being felt in all communities today. This roundtable discussion, we are going to be asking some questions about the system's role or potential role in addressing the housing and community development needs of Hawaii and American Samoa and access to the Federal Home Loan Bank systems, products and services. While our roundtable discussions are with a small group of speakers, we are live streaming the discussion so that we can reach stakeholders and extend the reach to as many potential stakeholders as possible. We also believe it is critical to meet with local constituents and hear about local issues and topics, in addition to concerns that may be shared on a more national basis. We look forward to the discussion today and the feedback we will receive as we continue this initiative. With that, let me thank the roundtable participants again for your participation and turn it back over to Amy, who will share the guidelines for our discussion.
Thank you, Tiffany. Let's review some rules of engagement. First, Tiffany and I will be moderating for the discussion today. We will be posing questions to you. We expect and hope that we will have an open and engaging discussion. No question, no recommendation or view should be considered off the table, and we encourage you to offer differing views about some important questions that we will be covering. We also want this to be orderly, and we would like you to, when you would like to speak, or if you are asked to speak, please unmute your microphone and mute after you finish speaking. You may use the raise hand feature to signal you wish to speak. Please also keep your camera on for the duration of the roundtable. We ask that everyone engage, knowing that we may not agree on all points, but any differences will be shared in a respectful manner. To ensure that everyone has a turn to speak and that we cover each discussion topic, if someone is going long, Tiffany or I may interject to keep the conversation moving. Second, this review is meant to give a voice to the thinking of Federal Home Loan Bank System stakeholders and highlight areas for future consideration. We ask that you give us your best thinking and not just your thinking of what may be possible. Second, this review is, For the benefit of our audience, the roundtable participants have been given a set of prompts that we will reference during the course of this afternoon's discussion. Finally, we have a disclaimer that we need to make you all aware of, and that I will need to read verbatim. We have organized this roundtable to obtain your input on the mission of the Federal Home Loan Banks, including input on several specific questions that were sent to you prior to the meeting. During today's session, FHFA will not discuss the status or timing of any potential rulemaking. If FHFA does decide to engage in a rulemaking on any matters discussed today, this meeting would not take the place of a public comment process. The rulemaking document would establish the public comment process, and you would need to submit your comments, if any, in accordance with the submission instructions in that document. FHFA may summarize the feedback gathered at today's session in a future rulemaking document if we determine that a summary would be useful to explain the basis of the rulemaking. Anything said in this meeting, and that also includes reactions, nodding, eye rolling, should be not be construed as binding on or a final decision by the director of FHFA or FHFA staff. Any questions we may have are focused on understanding your views and do not indicate a policy or legal position. Participants in today's roundtable may have a financial interest, whether direct or indirect, on outcomes that may affect the Federal Home Loan Banks and their business. As Tiffany mentioned, today's roundtable will be live streamed on FHFA's website and video recorded. FHFA may also prepare a transcript of today's session, which would include the names of all speakers and the organizations they represent, if any. The recording and any transcripts prepared will be posted on FHFA's website and YouTube channel, along with any materials being presented today and or otherwise submitted in conjunction with the roundtable. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, we'd like to start the discussion with introductions, and I'll turn it back to Tiffany.
Great, thanks, Amy. Let me ask that each of you introduce yourself and state your affiliation with the Federal Home Loan Bank System, whether that be in your current capacity or a former capacity. Let's start with Phil and work our way around to everyone.
Hello, my name is Phil Backus. I'm the treasurer of American Savings Bank. I'm a member, our bank is a member of the FHLB system, specifically FHLB Des Moines, and I've had previous relationships at other institutions with FHLB New York and FHLB Atlanta. Thank you.
Heather.
Good morning. My name is Heather Piper. I'm the executive director of the Hawaii Community Reinvestment Corporation. We're a Hawaii-based non-depository CDFI. Prior to joining Hawaii Community Reinvestment Corporation, I did work at 2 member banks in Hawaii in the commercial lending side. And I'm also a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank Des Moines Advisory Council, Affordable Housing Advisory Council.
Michelle.
Good morning and aloha, Michelle Kalhane. I serve as the Senior Vice President and Chief Impact Officer at the Hawaii Community Foundation. We are currently providing a capacity building and technical assistance program for local CDFIs here on the island. I formerly operated 2 different CDFIs in my career, but working closely with the local CDFIs like Heather and Kuhio currently, and have been a partner with a national intermediary, OWISTA, who has been a recipient and a source for local CDFIs. Thank you.
Kuhio.
Hi, aloha everyone. I'm Kuhio Lewis. I'm the CEO for the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement. We are also a non-depository CDFI. We're a native CDFI. We're actually the largest non-depository CDFI in the state. We have around $16 million portfolio, but happy to be a part of this discussion. We also received some pass-through funds from some of your members, like OWISTA Corporation. So happy to share our experiences. Mahalo.
And finally, Scott.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Scott Fuji. I'm the CRA or Community Reinvestment Act Officer at Bank of Hawaii, and Bank of Hawaii is a member. We operate branches on all 6 islands in Hawaii and also in the territory of Guam and the island of Saipan in the CNMI on here. I've got maybe 30 years of bank experience, probably a little over 10 in regulatory compliance, of which I'm responsible for your program at Bank of Hawaii on here. And again, our bank is pretty active in the consumer loan mortgage origination market, as well as being a commercial bank. Wasn't born in Hawaii. Spent some time in Tokyo before coming here, raised in Oregon, but definitely happy to be living in a place like Hawaii. Thank you.
Thank you all for the introductions. We're going to go ahead and dive into the session topic. So with that, I will turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you. So let's start by laying the groundwork for this discussion. And we wanted to focus on the opportunities and challenges in Hawaii, and to the extent possible, but maybe unfortunately not as much today, on American Samoa. I would note that we endeavored to include speakers from American Samoa, but unfortunately the people we contacted declined our invitations. However, if to the extent that any of the panel members feel that you have things to add on things that may be relevant also for American Samoa, that would be helpful for us to understand. But we will reach out and be in contact with other people outside of this forum going forward. So what do you think it is important for the banks, for FHFA, and for other listeners to know about really the unique conditions that face Hawaii, and that we may not know if, for those of us particularly living on the East Coast of the US. I guess I would like to start with Phil, then Michelle, but I'd like to give everyone an opportunity on this question. Phil, I think you're unmuted, so you can go ahead. Can you hear me?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I didn't hear the full.
Okay. We would like to know, what do you think it is important for the banks, for FHFA, and for other listeners to know about the unique conditions that face Hawaii, and that maybe we may not know, particularly those of us who live on the other coast of the US?
Great. Thank you. And sorry for not hearing the first time. Yeah, Hawaii is a very unique market. I would say that, if you think about what's going on across the United States right now, where we're talking about housing prices coming down in light of what's going on in the economy, we haven't really seen a huge reduction in values here. And that speaks to some of what is unique about the Hawaii market. I would say that home ownership is one of the main sources of wealth within the population in Hawaii. And because you're on an island, again, in islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you have limited space and area, so that essentially you're in a place where the supply of housing will always outstrip demand. And that has created a real different, and I would say, imbalance between the, again, supply and demand, as well as the housing affordability situation here in Hawaii. If you think about just the island of Oahu, the median home price here is a little bit under $1 million, but the median income household for the entire household is a little under around $92,000, right? So that tells you the gap that you would see here in Hawaii. I would say that, relative to what you would see statewide in other places, the gap is a lot more narrow, generally speaking.
Yeah. So you're talking about a 9 or 10 to 1 ratio of house prices. That's high. I mean, from looking, it's not the best, the only metric, but just off the top, that's exactly. That's a concerning metric. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and then if you think about the complexion of the population as well, it just takes a lot to spend, right? The cost of normal goods and services will essentially be higher here on the islands. Therefore, you're spending a lot more on non-housing. Therefore, your housing payments as a percentage of your total spend is I would say, typically under pressure, relatively speaking.
Thank you. Michelle, what would you like to add to that? Oh, please unmute.
There are a couple of things. First, I want to follow up on Phil's comments and say that in Hawaii, we are highly sensitive to our ALICE population, and ALICE is the acronym for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed. And so while many of the housing programs look at 80% or below area median income, we really look at Hawaii's ALICE population. And it's important because our statistics, the data shows us that almost 1 out of every 2 households falls within this category, which makes housing stability and security a challenge based on some of the factors that Phil has already described. Second, I will say that unlike most areas across the country, Hawaii is highly dependent on the for-profit sector for our affordable housing units. We lack the capacity and the availability of nonprofit CDCs who are doing the kind of robust affordable housing development that I have witnessed across the country. And then third, I would lay down that we still have a capital access problem in Hawaii. We have what we call homestead associations or land set aside by Congress in the 1920 Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. It was enacted in 1921, very similar to the 1906 Indian Allotment Act that set aside lands for Indian reservations on the continent. We have a capital access issue and an inability to effectively draw down the resources made available through the Federal Home Loan Bank to be utilized on our trust lands in Hawaii. And so for me, those would be the sort of the top 3 things around these challenges that I think are worthy of us highlighting.
Thank you. Kuhio, do you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. Michelle started to touch on this, but one factor that's unique to Hawaii is that we have a Native Hawaiian community here. And for the first time in our history, more Native Hawaiians live outside of Hawaii than in their own homeland. And that's largely due to access to capital, being able to survive here. So our CDFI, we work with the most vulnerable populations, those that can't gain access to banking products at the big banks. And so we try to get them ready. We try to prepare them for get them access to those big banks. Unfortunately, there's more vulnerable people in Hawaii now, and we don't have the capital to support that growing population. And that might be something going on all over the place, but it's particularly heavy on Hawaii because some of the points that were raised by Phil and Michelle. I'll say that.
Thank you. Scott? Oh, could you please unmute?
One point that perhaps some people aren't aware of is Hawaii is a majority minority state, which may be very unique. And it's also comprised of many islands on here. And the diversity is actually a plus for the state. I mean, when you look at it as an advantage, what are the advantages on here? Perhaps a disadvantage, one that I tend to look at when having not been born here, was always remembering how much food you put away for an emergency. And it was always this 3-day supply thing. And then I happened to look at the Hawaii.gov site and I see that it's 14 days for Hawaii on here. And I don't know if you can ever imagine anybody putting away 14 days worth of food, waiting for FEMA to arrive when there's an emergency. And there's so much climate change going on that, and we've experienced so much in the last 6 or 7 years on here that I think that's certainly something just to create some awareness of, because we're isolated here, whereas the contiguous states have a lot of resources that they can draw upon. Thanks.
Thank you. And Heather?
Great, thank you. I think they covered most of it. I was just going to add a couple of things. Regards to natural disasters, we are very vulnerable to natural disasters. And some of them are not the same that they might have on the continental US. On our island of Hawaii, we have volcanic eruption that is going on that has destroyed homes and businesses. We have the threat of hurricanes every year. You know, it's not when are we going to have it's not if we're going to have a hurricane, it's when. You know, if you just watch like a hurricane tracker, we're this little tiny dot and hurricanes are constantly going over and under us. It's just a matter of when one's going to hit us. Tsunamis, we have the threat of tsunamis and earthquakes, which go along with the tsunamis. So vulnerability to natural disaster. And as Scott said, the reason why we have suggested to have a 2-week food supply for every household is the states have less than 2 weeks of food on island for its people. So if we did get hit with a natural disaster where our ports were closed or airports are closed, they can't bring in any more food. And we saw that in the beginning of COVID, where a lot of shelves were empty for a lot of common products. So our banking situation in Hawaii is quite different. We have no big major bank presence here. We're very strong with our community regional banks, Bank of Hawaii and First Hawaiian being the 2 largest, and then American Savings and Central Pacific Bank following, which does create a little bit of a market differential here when it comes to accessing bank capital, particularly for like developers or CDFIs. A lot of banks on the continental US will go into a marketplace, and for CRA credit, they will invest in affordable housing projects so that they can get their CRA credit. We don't have those banks coming in here putting out millions of dollars of money to CDFIs and developers for affordable housing because they don't need to, because they're not coming here. You know, they're not moving to Hawaii to open a branch. So that's a little bit different here. The last thing is our economy. You know, we were very service-driven economy with our tourism industry. Those are not the highest paying jobs. So for many years, we kind of fed this economy built on not high paying jobs and didn't keep up with providing housing for that group of workers. We have a lot of influence from not only continental mainland people moving over here, but also from Asia and other places, because we are a very desirable place to live. So we get a lot of outside investment into the housing market that actually takes away housing for our local people. And a lot of them, they don't rent it out, they sit empty. So when you look at our housing inventory in whole, there is housing that has been taken out of the market for our people. So I'll leave it with that.
Okay, thank you. That helps us to sort of understand where we have, some of the same issues that are we've seen in other places, but they play out very differently, it sounds like, in many respects. But now we want to get into more specifics. What are the opportunities and challenges with affordable housing and community development initiatives in Hawaii? And I like everyone to have a chance, but I would start with Kuhio if you have thoughts on this.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to connect it. So first of all, there's a lack of access to Heather's right. A lot of the big banks don't come, they're not here, you know, like Wells Fargo and the Bank of America, they don't have a strong presence here. And so access to more capital for these affordable housing developers, I think, is really important. I would also add that there just needs to be a better coordination within the banking arena, or any, you know, like the relationship between CDFI community and banks in Hawaii, I would say is almost non-existent. I'm not even clear if they understand what CDFIs do and the populations that we serve. We have multiple loans with banks outside of Hawaii where they lend us money at a lower interest rate and we relend it. We have none with local banks. So that's a problem that I feel needs to be addressed. I mean, how come they're not looking at how we're supporting the vulnerable populations, getting them bank ready so they can bank with them? So it's a conversation that I think needs to better communication between those of us that are serving the more vulnerable and the banks in Hawaii. And I think that in itself would support the housing issue. There is a problem with, in terms of just land, there's a lack of land available to develop as well in our islands. We're running out of land. So obviously you need to be creative with how you do affordable development in our islands. But I would say capital, access to capital is probably the biggest barrier, at least in my opinion. And Heather's also from the CDFI, and I'm sure she can add.
And I will turn next to Heather.
Great, thank you. Ditto everything Kohio said. Access to capital, I think, for our CDFIs to support developers is a big thing. And as we said, our CDFIs are not members of the Federal Home Bank. We're not quite big enough. If you heard Kohio say he's the largest CDFI here at 16 million, that's big for Hawaii, but on a national scale, it's not big. So we have, I think, maybe find creative ways where we could maybe pull together our CDFIs to try to become a HUI member, which is like a co-op member or something. And then the other thing is just the development in general in Hawaii. It is so expensive. Everything that is not grown in Hawaii is either flown in or shipped in. So our cost for everything across the board is expensive. So our development costs are much higher and things take a long time in Hawaii. It's normal for 3 years to get through the pre-development just to a permitting process. And this kind of ties into some of the bank's programs, the Federal Home Loan Bank programs. They're not built for long, slow development, which is what Hawaii is. And so, being a banker myself from the past, when things aren't what I think they should be on schedule, you kind of think projects are going sideways, but they may not be going sideways. It's just the way it is in Hawaii. I mean, it's totally normal to expect a project from conception to occupancy to be 7 years. I mean, that's normal here. Obviously, that length of time increases costs. So flexibility, I think, on understanding our cost here per project, per door, per unit is so much higher, and the time it takes to get projects done is so much longer in Hawaii.
Thank you. Did anyone else have thoughts on that? Please just indicate with the raise your hand. Phil?
Yeah, I would like to
And then
echo
Scott.
what was said. Yeah, I think there could be more integration and I would say interaction between CDFIs and banks. I'm actually on the board of a CDFI specifically targeted towards food security and the farming area. But, we could think about ways to really bring those two groups together, right? And I would say one of the reasons why you would see, the mainland banks be able to provide dollars of grant funding and things like that to CDFIs is because, again, they're much bigger. So therefore they have a lot more scale to able to, I would say, sock away millions of dollars for the purposes of low income or affordable housing development, things like that. So that's something that, we've encountered, in my other experiences that I've had, but definitely room for improvement there. And yeah, the permitting issue is one that, sometimes will take because of the length of time to get something done, you might end up outside of a window in order to qualify for various types of grant funding or some of the programs that are first come, first serve, or there's a kind of a quick competition for those funds that takes us out of the running in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you. Scott, you were next, and then Michelle.
Sure. Probably to Kuhio's questions on there, or what he was sharing on there, we fully agree. I think there's always room for improvement in relationships between the local banks and the CDFIs on here. I know that in some ways we probably depend upon our relationships with the Community Foundation to work us into working more closely with the CDFIs on here. I know that Sometimes our funding goes to helping a lot of nonprofits, but not exactly into the loan funds that the CDFIs help with, because I fully agree with Kuhio that there is an audience that needs capital on there that perhaps are not being served by the local banks on there. Back to maybe ideas for the federal home loan banks to consider on here, might be pre-development costs. I know we've been hearing more from organizations that they want to explore, but they don't want to be constrained by taking out a grant from the HP program and be constrained to 3 to 5 years on there without knowing a little bit more about whether it was really worth getting into on here. And so those are some expenses that are not necessarily being funded, and certainly a little bit more of a risk, but maybe something to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle?
I just want to add, again, in Hawaii, when we talk about affordable housing is just one piece of healthy community development. And we tend to focus on the struggle that is affordable housing because of our high costs and where we are as a state in terms of home ownership rates. But I think that there is some need to stretch beyond just the housing need, and to think about what a robust community development program across the state would look like in terms of job creation. Heather talked about our reliance on tourism that generates some lower paying jobs. How do we support small business as really foundational and a backbone to our economy here in the islands? And so there's a huge focus on affordable housing, as we should. But just want to note that the muscle and the capacity around robust community development needs to be grown here in the islands. We are one of the most highly regulated states for housing development. I think we rank #1. So the time involved in permitting and processing and land use, and if we find bones, we've got all kinds of processes that make it unaffordable, unpredictable, and therefore difficult for development to occur. We also adopted really policy that made it difficult to allow housing to flourish because we passed the burden of infrastructure costs for roads, water, sewer to developers, who then pass that cost on to borrowers who we already outlined are in this category of ALICE, 1 out of every 2 families. And so that strategy and that mechanism of having private developers foot the cost of full infrastructure doesn't really support the economy or the local buyers. It just increases the cost of the local buyer. I think that's an important aspect. And those are my additions to that conversation.
And in your earlier comments, you had mentioned that a significant amount of the affordable housing is built by for-profit developers. How does that factor in, and how does that influence the market? Just like whether it's the price or the type of housing built?
Yeah, I think that it's the price again. It also creates a dynamic because families can't reach that price point that these developers are putting out, that they get couched to be these evil developers. They're not evil. They just have a different business model. They have a different role. We all have a role to play, and they have a role to address a certain segment of our community, but it doesn't reach to the depths of the community where housing is needed the greatest, right? So for families, you've heard from Phil that the 80% AMI doesn't afford you what is affordable in most of those developments because the for-profit development gets incentivized, and they might have some subsidies that they offset because they're selling market rate units. But in a fully affordable development by a nonprofit CDC, they're doing a capital stack that really buys down and puts it into an affordable status that is very different than a mixed income project that we see typical in Hawaii, but when our average sales price is nearing $1 million or topping $1 million, then affordable in a project could be $500,000, still not in reach for many families, especially if they're at 80% or below the area median income. And so there's a role for for-profit development for sure, but they are not accessing the same subsidies, the same kinds of programs that buy down the cost of the units to get true affordability as we're seeing in other areas of the country.
Okay, thank you. And just while we're on sort of this topic of opportunities and challenges, I think several of you had earlier touched on the issue of climate change and also about vulnerability to natural disasters. How does that, I mean, I can kind of guess how that factors into affordable housing, but are there elements of housing construction that are affected by the need, say, to protect against certain kind of hazards that would further affect either cost or development times?
Well, I think you had folks on yesterday from Guam, and maybe I realize that's not our topic, but they of course get affected by earthquakes as well as tsunamis on here. So their homes many times require structurally, I mean, concrete and not just on the foundation, but above ground also on here, which can certainly add to cost on here. And certainly their AMI is well below what it is in Hawaii on there. And certainly the same things here. I mean, everybody sort of reacts to what's going on. I know, I believe in Oregon, there's certain areas of the city where they're requiring clips to the foundation just because the ground's moving on here. Whereas in Hawaii, of course, there's an added cost of people adding on hurricane clips to keep the roof on there, just as an example.
Thank you. Heather, I see your hand up.
Sure, I was just gonna follow up on Scott's comment. So the building houses that can survive hurricane winds does increase cost. So, you know, you have your natural disasters that may or may not be a result of climate change. But then we also have the other side here where Hawaii is pushing to be completely on renewable energy by, I think it's 2045. So we have a huge push for renewable energy, solar photovoltaic, which can be built into housing projects. It also adds additional cost. So the cost to build the type of housing you really want and need is much higher here. And I don't think we've had the situation here, but I did want to say that if there was ever a natural disaster that did destroy a project that might be funded with AHP funds, that we are forgiving to it. And I think the current practice is you still hold the developer accountable to complete the AHP period, where it's just something that we might want to think about adding in, is that if a natural disaster does destroy a project, I think it should just be forgiven. So that's just my little 2 cents on that.
Thank you. And
You know, we did have a project in American Samoa, Heather, just to that point. I only bring that up because I believe the project was supposed to be 50 homes renovated or built, and I believe during that time period there were actually 2 typhoons that hit American Samoa, and the materials were in 2 containers from Home Depot, and they both got destroyed. The project was reduced to 24 units, and it was rescored, and it's still qualified, I believe, and it finished the retention period and sort of went down the path. But I only just brought that up as an example that I guess I've seen from experience.
Yeah, it's also impacting the insurance costs. You know, how do you insure those buildings? Also, how you essentially are able to design a building from the ground up in relation to sea level rise, climate change, obviously on Big Island in particular, volcanic activity.
Thank you. Several of you had, someone had alluded earlier to the challenges during the COVID pandemic. And were there any specific challenges that we should be aware of as to either the availability and condition of housing stock, energy, supplies, labor, or availability of housing across incomes? And I see Heather stand up.
Sure. I think like most of the world, the supply chain disruption hit Hawaii big, and probably more impact because it's not just trucks and trains, it's ships, right? I mean, we add on that extra shipping cost. So we did have major supply chain challenges, and I'm sure it went across everything from groceries to building supplies. And of course, that led to an increase in building supplies, which increased cost. And for projects that had already had a budget pre-COVID, you know, their budget might be a little bit out of whack if they were still continuing through COVID, not to mention the delays that were caused by delays in actually working and constructing projects, right? So that was one part of it. I think just in general, keeping in mind the high cost of everything in Hawaii to get here and how it affects our projects. And Phil had mentioned, you know, insurance. So in Hawaii, we do have hurricane insurance, which is very expensive. And so that's just another cost that gets added on to either the developer or the homeowner, which, you know, so it's not just regular insurance. Hurricane insurance is quite expensive in Hawaii.
Thank you. Kuhio, did you have something to add?
Well, I was just gonna say the pandemic did hit us pretty hard in Hawaii. But I was gonna say that, you know, within the pandemic, there was also amazing opportunities that came out of it. It allowed us to revisit, relook at the way we live, the way that we can operate, self-sustain. You know, like for the first time, there was nobody on Waikiki Beach, right? During the pandemic, we were shut down. And so it allowed us to envision what Hawaii could look like in a more managed way. It allowed us to work closer with the federal government, you know, in terms of the resources that came down to help stabilize our community. I believe our relationship with our community actually increased during the pandemic because we had to look to each other to find solutions. So there was some, I guess all I wanted to add was, yes, there was a tremendous amount of challenges, but within that had these gems that came out of it as well.
Oh, thank you. And Heather?
Thank you, Kuhio. Triggered what I was going to say. During the pandemic, there were a lot of federal funds that came here, particularly for rental assistance and also rapid rehousing for homeless families. And it was unfortunate that there were organizations that had the funds, had the families ready to go, and they couldn't find units to put them in because our supply of housing just wasn't there. And so, you know, it's sad when you actually have all this federal money coming in and you finally get these families ready to house and there's no units available. So I think that's just another example of how our supply is so short.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to pivot a little bit and turn to the current role of the Federal Home Loan Bank System. And to provide just a little bit of detail for our audience, there are 23 Federal Home Loan Bank members in Hawaii, about 11 of whom either accessed advances or letters of credit at year end last year. AHP activity has been relatively small, I think in part for many of the reasons discussed, and including very limited funds in the homeownership set aside that have ended up going to Hawaii. So I'd like to start, I think, with Scott on this question. We would appreciate hearing your perspectives regarding the role that the Federal Home Loan Bank System is now playing in Hawaii.
We've used it. We've been asked to utilize it for the HP program. I think we had, maybe it's an opportunity to talk about the HP program and one of the applications we had submitted. We had not submitted one for a number of years on here. And I think part of that was some of it could have been demand, but the other part was, of course, is the challenges with the other bank that merged into your bank or the Des Moines Bank on here that they went through. But with this one, it was our first in a number of years, and it was in West Oahu. It was a rehab, so it wasn't a project that needed to be built from the ground up. So we weren't concerned too much with development as much as we were with just, cost of repapering a wall type of situation on here or replacing a door. But it didn't score, and the Federal Home Loan Bank was gracious enough to spend a lot of time with us. They are going to come out at the end of the month, and I believe that's one of the projects they'll take a look at on here. But they did point out a number of things in their scoring that potentially would have helped us. But one of the challenges we do have here is there are a lot of projects that maybe I'm not sure if it's not cultural, but where projects just won't score well in under the programs. Some of the projects that are innovative here in Hawaii, some of them want to forego federal money. Some of them own their own land out of choice. They're not dependent upon state or federal land for various reasons. And they build homes differently just because the village concept is very strong, not just in Hawaii, but in the West Pacific on here. But those are just my thoughts.
Thank you. Any others, and specifically regarding affordable housing and home ownership, and then I also wanted to ask about community and economic development. Kuhio, and then Heather.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that, one of the biggest affordable housing developers in our state is the Department of Hawaiian Homelands.
Okay.
So that's a federal trust, right? It's a trust in place to support Native Hawaiians of 50% ancestry. There is a wait list of 28,000 waiting for a home. Many of them are dying on that list. And one of the biggest challenges, separate from just development costs, is trying to qualify families to afford those houses once they're developed. So I do want to commend, because both Bank of Hawaii and American Savings Bank have products that can support home ownership, but we're having a very hard time qualifying our families to afford these turnkey units that are developed for them. They need greater access to capital. We need more creative products that can support that specific population. And the banks just I guess they need more incentives, but that's affordable housing, and you have 20,000 people waiting on that list.
Heather.
Great. Just to follow up to Kuhio's comment. So the Federal Home Loan Bank's down payment product, which is not utilized here. And I'm going to say it took me many years to figure out one of our challenges. And one of the challenges is it's limited to people who earn 80% or less of AMI. And many of our families here that are on the first time home ownership programs with organizations like Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement and others, they're up to 120% AMI. So 120% AMI. So they can't access the down payment program because they make too much money, but they don't make enough money to purchase a house without subsidy. So I think that's a gap. And I believe that's a statutory 80% AMI. It's not a bank level or FHFA level. So that would be one thing to look at. Second thing is in allowing the Federal Home Loan Banks to have different project caps within a funding round for its different communities it serves. Maybe capping 500,000 in Missouri might be a good cap, but Hawaii might need a $2 million cap. So, and I believe the way the funding round works now, it's got to be same across the board for all the members and applicants in a region. So allowing each Federal Home Loan Bank maybe to have some flexibility of setting caps by community and by maybe some just, standard proxies about the affordable housing cap and things. So that was just a very specific request.
Thank you. Kuhio, then Scott. And then Michelle.
I think I already weighed in on it. I can let Phil or Scott.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Heather was just talking about regarding the Home Start program. And of course, her answer to me is way more logical, that it should be just an increase to the 80%. But, it wasn't until a few years ago that I found out that the down payment amounts amongst the various Federal Home Loan Banks are very different with their down payment programs. And, we're, again, part of the Des Moines Bank. And I think the folks there are actually really, really good and knowledgeable on here. But it's probably hard for them to fathom the down payment requirements to be able to get into a home here in Hawaii and how much money you need. We're likely in the same boat as the folks that maybe are members of the San Francisco Bank in that respect on here. But I just bring that up because, if the 80% is statutory, I'm not sure if perhaps the ideas of flexibility due to cost of living or CPI or something in states where it's much higher shouldn't be taken into account on there. Thank you.
I want to echo both Heather and Scott. And I think the difference here is that we are using an equality ratio versus an equity ratio. And we need an equity ratio to distribute those resources, considering that Hawaii has not been able to, even when there is an allocation, get access to those resources, right? The complexity, while the affordable housing program is one of the largest sources of private sector capital for down payment assistance, we have federal level compliance attached to this private capital. Heather and I were having this conversation. And so the complexity of using the product, of creating partnerships with the banks so that we can access this capital. We have a beautiful $15,000 down payment available to be utilized on Hawaiian homelands, and we can't draw it down. The other issue is that there is recapture on some of this, and it's not necessary if it's private capital. I'm confused as to what the challenge is, why we are facing the challenge we have in utilizing the resource on Hawaiian homelands, and just want to dig a little bit deeper. Because it is private capital, how do we remove some of the restrictions to getting access to these dollars, and thinking about the appropriate levels of down payment assistance that are truly needed in Hawaii? What Heather's pointing out in the 120% AMI and why ALICE has become an acronym that we've gravitated to in Hawaii is because it is addressing a huge population within Hawaii that falls outside of that 80% AMI gap, but is struggling to survive. And as a result, you heard from Kuhio earlier, we have more Native Hawaiians living outside their homeland than we do here in Hawaii. So the need to pay attention to those families who are slightly above that 80 percentile, but not quite over 120, there's a need to figure out what the housing solutions and how we bridge the gap specifically for the state of Hawaii, given the unique set of circumstances that we face here.
Thank you. Heather, I think you had your hand up. Kuhio, I didn't know if you had another comment or if you just left your hand raised on the screen. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just tap onto the compliance portion of it, and maybe Phil or Scott can also weigh in on this. The programs have so much compliance requirements that they become unattractive for developers and banks to want to sponsor or get into, because compliance takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of expertise, large banks on the mainland may have departments that are able to do this type of compliance and staff that do this day in and day out. For, you know, a regional bank, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to follow all the compliance requirements for these programs, and for the developer, it's a lot of work. And I think there are some situations where the federal home loan banks are allowed to kind of buddy up with another federal program like low-income housing tax credits for monitoring and things. But I think it should be, if they're already doing compliance for any government funding, they should be able to accept it and not have to redo it, on different forms, recalculate different ratios, do things. Reducing the compliance might make it more attractive for the sponsors and the developers to actually try to access these funds. And especially when, you know, the funds that they're accessing in Hawaii are so small in the capital stack. It, you know, doesn't make it attractive to really want to go out and do it. So I'm trying to figure out how to make it more attractive to people to want to access it. So increasing the limits and reducing the compliance and just making it simpler. As Michelle said, this is the Federal Home Bank does not receive federal appropriations. This is their funding that they're doing in grant programs. So is there any way we could reduce their compliance burden?
Thank you. Yes. One thing, I guess, are there any other, maybe we've touched on this a little bit. What about CDFI membership in the Des Moines Bank? And I think we've touched on that a little bit before. And I think it was mentioned that the size of the institutions may be one factor that have limited membership because there aren't CDFI, non-depository CDFIs from Hawaii that are members. But are there any other factors? Are there any things that would make it more desirable to become a member or more able to become a member? I guess I would like to ask Heather and then maybe Michelle.
Sure. So understanding how the Federal Home Loan Bank advances funds to its members, I think, is important. You know, they advance funds, but they take collateral, and the collateral are loans. And these are loans that are pretty standard loans, secured by first mortgages, sometimes second mortgages, and pretty standard longer terms and things. Whereas the CDFIs in Hawaii, I don't believe we have the collateral that we could provide to support the advances, and definitely not at the dollar amount to make financial sense. For instance, most of my loans for our organization are unsecured, and they may be for housing purposes like pre-development financing, but we're unsecured. So we wouldn't be able to pledge them. For like organizations like Kuhio's, they might be mortgages secured by a home on a Department of Hawaiian homelands, which I don't think they would accept as collateral either. So it might just be our CDFIs are not at the point yet where we are big enough or have the right portfolio to become members. And I don't know if there's any way we could figure out amongst ourselves to have maybe a partnership with the bank where we could be like sub-members of the bank membership. You know, like with nonprofits, they sometimes have fiscal sponsors until they get big enough. So maybe we should explore something like that, having a bank be a fiscal sponsor for CDFI, where you know, through the bank we could maybe access the funds. That's just my top of my head thought for CDFIs.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's what Heather raises is really important. So first and foremost, I think there's a lack of understanding just locally about the Federal Home Loan Bank's programs, maybe well known by the banks, but less known by community-based organizations on how to partner or access those resources. And so to her point that it's important to understand how they capitalize, because she's absolutely correct. We're doing unsecured deals and providing access to capital without having the kind of regulatory compliance that the banks are subject to, which make buying their portfolios a lot easier. That being said, I would love to see some coordination through the larger national intermediaries, because when I think about how Federal Home Loan Bank is getting its resources to Hawaii, Kuhio is the recipient of Federal Home Loan Bank dollars that he shared through OISTA, which is a native CDFI and a national intermediary for other native CDFIs. So how might we partner to create those that leverage for our local CDFIs with the big intermediaries? Can we be a pass-through and subrecipient of Enterprise, of LISC, of RCAC, all of which we have small relationships with here and there amongst the CDFIs? But can we leverage those larger intermediaries as partners for us to help support the size of our CDFIs until we can apply and be members on our own? That would be a nice step in capacity building and growth to bring that necessary resource. When I think about the knowledge that I have or lack of, most of what I know about Federal Home Loan Bank is through OISTA, through being a native CDFI and attending workshops and conferences put on by them where Des Moines was present, and we got a briefing and shared. But I think that because we're here in the middle of the Pacific, that outreach and the extension and understanding of who Federal Home Loan Bank is and how we actually tap into those programs has been a different challenge for the state of Hawaii. And so there are ways. COVID taught us to do this really well. We can Zoom everything. And so hopefully there is a way that we can be more creative about the outreach and sharing of what might be possible. And with greater awareness, more creativity comes out of how we leverage partnerships to ensure that those resources reach our island state.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to hear more on a lot of this, but we do have to move on to the future role of the bank system. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tiffany.
Great, Michelle, you've already kind of started hitting on a lot of great things as far as the future and reimagining what the Federal Home Loan Bank system would look like. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about this creativity piece and innovation a little bit. What do you think, and I would love to hear from others as well, what you all think is needed to stimulate more engagement or action to increase access to and the use of Federal Home Loan Bank products?
Hey, Scott, this is what I think we should have every bank adopt a CDFI. Let's create a mentorship and symbiotic partnership where every bank, right? There's a current Federal Home Loan Bank program that will allow matching dollars for banks to get 3-to-1 for what you grant. I would love to see our banks each engage, take on a CDFI, commit them a grant, get the 3-to-1 match from Federal Home Loan Bank that would help them, whether that's for loan capital or for operating dollars. It would be awesome to have symbiotic relationships between each of the banks and our CDFIs to be more participatory so that we can think creatively together about how to access the products that are available through their membership with FHLB.
Great. Heather, I'm seeing you shaking your head. Oh, perfect. Phil, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, just one comment. I think a couple of folks have mentioned low-income housing tax credits as one of the, historical ways that banks have been able to make equity investments in low-income housing. I think that's obviously one example of what has worked in the past, but what are the other ways that, and this is, again, a bigger question that I think in just the Federal Home Loan Bank system. This is more about how can we fill that gap in between the CDFIs and the banking system, right? You have assets that are bankable, meaning that from a regulatory perspective, you could add them to your balance sheet. We are restricted as banks in how we deploy equity investments. So what can we do to think creatively in terms of the regulatory aspects of deploying capital, deploying equity into investments? Maybe you deploy equity into a CDFI. Maybe you deploy equity into a deal that may not paper out, but from a pure profit-making perspective, right? So those are the things that I think, if I think about it from a banking perspective, can be I would say, strategized amongst a group of people. It's really that gap, right, that exists. Not only we have a gap from a population perspective when we talk about ALICE, but there's also a gap in terms of where financing is coming from and the efficacy of that financing and the size of it in order to make a dent in some of these challenges that we face here in Hawaii.
Scott, I see your hand up, please.
Sure. A few questions ago, Kuhio had brought up, the idea of banks playing well, actually, it was more on opportunities that were created by COVID, as opposed to, the challenges on here. And it sort of dawned on me that certainly, and it sort of goes back to what Phil was saying also, is like, how do we get banks to get into this arena of providing funds for CDFIs? Well, I think actually our bank, as part of our contribution to the Community Foundation's Resilience Fund, committed, I think, $1 million to a social impact fund, of which Michelle's folks managed on there, and I believe some of it went to CDFIs or all of it on here. But I mean, it was a way for the banks out of COVID to get their feet wet, and hopefully it went to the right people that we're talking about on here. And I'm just thinking that sometimes it's situations like that. Maybe it's not as direct, but it's a way for our folks at the top to see that their funding went to exactly where they wanted it to go, because they have the right people, the CDFIs, making those decisions on it. Anyway, thank you.
Heather, please. Yes.
Great. So back to the idea of where do we want to see the Federal Home Loan Banks going in the future? I think if we kind of take lessons learned from when Hawaii was part of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Seattle, through the merger to Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines now, there are people like Scott and myself who have been in the banking industry the whole trip. Some people are newer to it. So I think we have to just look forward and figure out how can the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines best serve Hawaii. They are coming out, I think, in the next couple of weeks to do some outreach. I think it's important when they're here to engage with them and really share the challenges that maybe the banks and the developers have working through their products. And again, is it challenges at the member bank level, challenges at the Federal Home Loan Bank level, or challenges at the FHFA level, right? So we can kind of figure out how to improve, make the process simpler, more attractive, so that we can actually get some more of our affordable housing developers on board with trying to access some of these funds, and get the banks on board with trying to sponsor them. So it's not just such a overwhelming burden of compliance for them. That's where I would like to see our efforts go.
That's helpful. Thank you. Oh, Scott, please.
Well, to this question about where we see the Federal Home Loan Bank having more of a role, and it sort of goes back to what Heather was saying with, how often the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines comes out to Hawaii. I don't know if they've ever been to Saipan, but I think that the question is perhaps why not try to reopen an office maybe in Hawaii, be bold, and have them certainly speak to the local leaders about what they're trying to be a catalyst for on that. And being here in Hawaii versus being on the West Coast would probably be certainly a lot closer for our friends in Guam and Saipan.
Great. Heather, please. Yeah.
I think you would have no problem finding Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines employees wanting to relocate to Hawaii.
FHFA staff too, I would imagine, so. Definitely. Since we're talking about this and wanting to kind of reimagine the Federal Home Loan Bank system, I wanted to take a bit of time to talk about the mission-related programs that the banks offer. We've talked a lot about the AHP, but we know that there's, of course, CIP and SECA that's also available, those advances that are there to support economic development and community development. But wanted to dig a little deeper into this as well. Are there mission-related programs that the banks should consider? Is there something innovative that you are seeing that's happening in Hawaii or in other places across the country that you think would be really innovative for the Federal Home Loan Bank system to consider overall? What would those features look like? And what role do you see the Federal Home Loan Bank system playing in supporting the development of these particular programs as well? Perfect, Heather. Great. Thank you.
I was going to say, I think that probably is a question for the member banks, right? Since they're the ones that have access to these funds. And it might be helpful to explain what the community advance is for the non-bankers on the call.
Perfect. So the community, oh, please go ahead, Phil.
No, I'll take a shot on that type of advance that you mentioned. It's basically a discounted rate advance capped at a certain limit, but the purpose of that is to really deploy those funds for specific purposes, right? So we've never really taken advantage of that in particular, but in terms of like what would I consider be a creative or something that is creative for the FHLB to engage in, I'll go back to low-income housing tax credits. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because, again, it's a tried and true federal program that has existed for years. Banks are very comfortable in engaging with it, and it's essentially a program where, banks are participating by investing equity capital into low-income housing deals, along with actual developer sponsors. And in return, you're getting essentially a tax credit, right? So that is kind of a carve out from an equity investment perspective that banks could participate in. So what if the FHLB were to also participate in those deals here in the state of Hawaii, either as an equity sponsor or as maybe someone who's providing soft debt or hard debt as part of the overall capital stack of a deal such as that? Right. And obviously the dollar amounts of those are going to be a lot different than the individual, home ownership plans, but that's a way to help provide, capital injections into these various low-income housing developments in order to make projects work and or paper out for some of the for-profit participants that was described earlier.
Great. Kahia, I wanted to turn to you a bit as well, though. I wanted to talk through this. I'm kind of hearing what Phil has discussed. Are there any other ideas or innovations that we should possibly consider that you think that might be something that we should kind of dig a little deeper into?
I guess I'll preference this by just saying I'm still trying to understand what you do. I mean, what programs are currently available. There's a lot for us to even understand, right? I mean, my focus as a CDFI is really on community development. So understanding what partners and relationships could benefit the work that we do is, so maybe just a crash course and understanding all that's currently available. That would be helpful. I mean, there's a lot of creativity going on at the community level. And I think just a nexus to pitch those ideas to like a platform for people so it's good for you to hear from us, but somehow the community-based solutions, I think, could support the banking decision-making or the regulatory systems. And we could be an intermediary in that way to help provide that. But yeah, anyway.
No, I like that. I'd love to actually talk to you a little bit more about that as well, though. We're talking about partnerships. And I guess, successful models that you've seen that we as the Federal Home Loan Banks and even as the FHFA, we could possibly leverage are some useful elements that we could consider to provide additional support to Hawaii and American Samoa and the other territories within the Federal Home Loan Bank system.
Yeah, Tiffany, I also think that our CDFIs have good boots on the ground because of the kinds of projects that they're financing to be a feeder for potential creative projects that could be sourced by Federal Home Loan Bank through the community development side, the dollars available for community development. Again, in our homestead communities, there are many community-based economic development projects in the homestead in Kapolei. There's a development underway right now that is to build a gas station, a Chick-fil-A, to create economic opportunity for the residents of that area. But they are going on beyond Kapolei in other communities. And how do we attract Federal Home Loan Bank capital sources to those kinds of projects that are really being driven by community leaders elected by their own homestead associations that don't have the, and perhaps that's a partnership with you, Kuhio, for your membership, right? To pull members who have community-based economic development projects going on so that we educate and we empower them with what these tools are so that we can be more creative about how we make use of those tools. So some kind of partnership for training and technical assistance to broaden the understanding of what might be possible together.
This is helpful. I saw Scott's hand up and then I'll go to Heather next.
Sure, Tiffany. Just briefly, a couple of things, but one on Kuhil's suggestion about a crash course. I think it would be great because I think it's sort of a suggestion that maybe it would be great if our Federal Home Loan Bank was a catalyst or came out to keep those conversations going about what's available and just keep reminding folks about it. I think the other point that I had was, and maybe it's just because I've been in banking for so long, I can remember back, and it goes to perhaps a success story about how banks in Hawaii are now comfortable supporting affordable housing, because a long time ago, they used to make loans to Heather's organization because they were comfortable doing it together. And until they got their legs underneath them and started doing that on their own. But it was an organization like Heather's that actually got everybody comfortable with financing affordable housing and understanding that, certainly beyond the need, that it was something that was definitely within the risk parameters to be taken advantage of, either for construction or for financing on here. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Scott. So Scott's referring to HCRC. This organization was founded in 1990, and it was founded as the bank consortium lender for the low-income housing tax credit loans. And it was supported fully by the banks, founded by the banks, supported by the banks for, probably 20 plus years. But as I think we've seen across the US, the model kind of faded away, especially in communities where the low-income housing tax credit deals became less scary for the banks to do. They had built up their own expertise in-house and things. And so, they were able to do these types of loans without having to go through a syndication with all the banks. So yeah, Scott, I think it's a good example though, how you can, do a test pilot to get banks comfortable doing some type of lending and then move on to the next product. I do want to just make sure that we differentiate what the Federal Home Loan Bank can do versus what its member banks are doing, because I don't think we want the Federal Home Loan Bank to become a direct lender to projects in Hawaii. I don't think that's what the intent of the Federal Home Loan Banks was. I think it is really reliant on its members to access their funds to then bring to the community. So, I think it's important to maybe build the relationship between the member banks, the community, and the member bank and the Federal Home Loan Bank. And I'm just going to say that, it just take advantage when they're here and they do visits. I know they were here pre-COVID and they did a couple of conferences and things, but not all the banks attended, so I think we have to engage when they're available and make sure, like Kuhio said, once we know what they can and cannot do and how we can access the funds, just a little bit more engagement and a little more knowledge of how we can help them with our member banks and our community organizations.
Great, that's really helpful. We've got about maybe 10 minutes left or so, and I definitely don't want to stop the conversation. It's really moving along. I'd like to make sure we kind of get everyone's ideas and thoughts in as we continue to engage. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this whole idea of pressing needs. We spent a lot of time talking about this. Amy really led the discussion at the outset, but kind of in a sense, as you all are thinking, we've gotten a lot of great ideas and thoughts here, and I'm just kind of thinking about some general takeaways as we start to wrap things up a little bit. But let's assume that we are only able to accomplish like one thing. You all have gotten so many great issues and out, but just curious, if we were only able to accomplish one thing, what do you all think would be the single best most important thing that should come out of this initiative that would support access to the Federal Home Loan Bank System in Hawaii, American Samoa, and the other territories, but specifically Hawaii? And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be the easiest or the most practical. Again, we talk about bold and innovative and creative ideas, but if we had a blank slate, what would be the one thing that you all want us to kind of really think about? I'm trying to figure out who I want to go to first, because I feel like you've all had some really great ideas with this though, but why don't I go to Phil first, and then I might go to Kuhio next, because I want to kind of dig a little deeper into this. I think you all have some great ideas, so.
Well, I think a quick win is really looking at what we're talking about as relates to the dollar amount for down payment assistance and the income limitations that are placed on that relative to the state of the market in Hawaii. I think that's one easy, a consistent thing that we could look at.
For me, if there's one takeaway, I'd like to be adopted by Bank of Hawaii right away. I'd like to see a better coordination between our CDFI community and our banks that are members of your organization.
Tiffany, I'm going to jump in here and
Please.
tell you what's running through my mind, that we have an extraordinary opportunity to make a huge impact in the Native Hawaiian community. Our state has appropriated in the last legislative session $600 million that gives our State Department of Hawaiian Homelands the flexibility to acquire land, to invest in infrastructure, to do vertical construction. It would be extraordinary to have the members of Federal Home Loan Bank, our banking partner, our banks, our regional banks here in Hawaii, to partner with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. Kuhio mentioned ASB and Bank of Hawaii already have 184A or FHA loan products that can be helpful. But if we could collaborate around catalyzing resources through Federal Home Loan Bank, through our member banks, to leverage that huge investment that could really change the trajectory of where this state agency goes and how they address the wait list, that would be amazing.
And when you talk about leverage investment, can you dig a little deeper? I think I know, but I just want to make sure clarifying what that really looks like for you, like step by step a little bit, like what does that look like?
Again, they have some state dollars. What are the products available through your member banks here in Hawaii that could be used alongside those state investment? They also bring down federal NAHASDA dollars, similar to the way other affordable projects are done on the continent. How do we build the proper capital stack to put a dent in that wait list, given that they have access to a significant amount of capital in front of them right now? They have a short timeline on which they need to encumber those dollars within the next 2 years. They're going to need partnership. They're going to need to leverage that to get as many people off that wait list as possible. So utilizing the products and services that are available through our member banks to leverage that $600 million would go a long way to help us addressing the wait list that Kuhil talked about earlier.
I think one of the things that Michelle mentioned that's very important is product, right? What is the type of product that we can offer as a member bank and deploy that while also staying in bounds of our regulatory and capital requirements as a regulated institution, right? So if you think about before 2008, before the global financial crisis to now, there's been a significant change in the types of mortgages, the types of assets that banks could invest in. And obviously we needed that because you had certain actors that were out there making bad investments. But I think a negative consequence of that has been, some of the products that were being targeted to some of this gap area, the Alice population, or some of the creative terms of these products, it's now harder for banks to do that. So can there be a certain carve out as it relates to the creation of those products to one, sit on the balance sheets of banks and potentially be pledged as collateral to the Federal Home Loan Bank to be borrowed against, right? So that's something that, again, I think it's beyond the FHFA. We have to think about all of the regulatory bodies that are involved in banking. But I think that's something that's, I would say, creative in terms of thinking about, where can these partnerships really stand in the gap that is created right now, and also be able to make sure that the banks will continue to be well capitalized, well managed, while having the creative products that will fit that specific area.
Thank you. Heather?
Great. I just wanted to go so I wouldn't forget my train of thought, but tying into what Michelle and Kuhil have said and what Phil has said, I think we have a really great opportunity with the amount of funds that is being allocated to the Native Hawaiians to specifically improve the housing affordability and economic development, that we should look for this opportunity as a way to figure out how to partner with them and figure out what products that the banks or the Federal Home Loan Bank has now that can help, and how they might need to be adjusted or changed to fit the situation. Our Department of Hawaiian Homelands, when a homeowner gets a property on the land, it's leased from the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. It's not fee, which does create additional. So I think, how do we make sure that we take this opportunity to make any adjustments we can to the products they're offering, whether it be the member bank or the Federal Home Loan Bank, and figure out what could be the roadblocks and address them early on so that we can support this huge initiative to support our Native Hawaiians, because we owe it to them to make sure that all the Native Hawaiians have a safe and happy place to call home.
Scott?
Just a couple things. One, to this grant program that the Des Moines Bank, and I realize it's not exactly your program, it would be great to remove the barriers and just make it available at the holding company level to a bank versus at the bank level. And I can certainly explain that offline if anybody had a question on that. And then certainly lastly for me, I think affordable housing, I sometimes look at it as being a symptom as opposed to the issue. There's a lot of other things that go beyond that. Mental health, a lot of things that are related to Alice that are being addressed right now. But I think it's you can certainly put people into homes, but there's a lot of things that need to go on. Financial education, certainly there's a lot of things that can go along with it that are community development. Thank you.
We're just about at time. I wanted to go ahead and give one more final opportunity. If we missed any great ideas and thoughts, you all have provided a host of ideas here this morning for you all, and afternoon for us here in the continental US. But wanted to just leave it open for any other final thoughts that you all may have, and you are always more than welcome to submit a public comment to us as well. We really want your feedback as we continue this initiative. All right. Well, with that, I will turn things back over to Amy to close us out.
Well, Tiffany and I thank you for your time and your thoughtful remarks. They're valuable to us to think about the issues in Hawaii. And we would not be remiss if we forgot to thank the FHFA staff who've been behind the scenes, that have reached out to everyone, that have made sure all the technology works, and done many, many other things that I don't have the time to mention, and that have made this and all the other events successful. So as we enter what we call the home stretch for soliciting stakeholder observations, perspectives, and ideas, I want to encourage everyone to make plans to join. There's a roundtable about Alaska on Monday, and the final listening sessions are next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. You can find more information about them on our website. And thank you all for your time today.